You? How dare you? You are obviously a nonconformist and a rebel.
Me? Rebel?
Arrest this man immediately.
Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. For those who are unaware, the U.S. Constitution is the legal basis for the federal government of the United States' existence, defining its structure, the power and authority of its branches, functions, and its limitations. But let's take a deeper look into the wording of the Second Amendment again, specifically this part. A well-regulated militia. A militia being a military force composed of non-state agents. Well-regulated, at the time the document was written, meant well-functioning. So, let's figure out what a well-functioning militia entails. Well, obviously, you need your militiamen be healthy. Lethargic, cancer-ridden lepers make terrible soldiers after all, and you need them to have good morale. An army of resentful malcontents with guns will probably desert your forces, undermine and subvert your efforts, and generally not be well-functioning. So, morale's good. How do we get morale, though? Well, obviously you make your troops happy. But how do you do that? What requirements for happiness do your troops have? Well, they'll differ from person to person. I can't speak for everyone, but I know that if I was provided a cup of pudding, I would have all the morale in the world. Since the Second Amendment for the United States Constitution stipulates that a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of the very state the Constitution exists to construct, the federal government of the United States must, as a matter of policy, provide for me a cup of chocolate pudding every day for the rest of my life to ensure my morale remains at its maximum should the security of a free state require me. If we take the text of the Second Amendment as a legitimate source that one can appeal to as the source of our rights as United States citizens, then I have just laid out the legal case for why I am legally owed pudding from them at no cost to myself as my entitlement. If free pudding is what would make you happy, then you should have it too. The Second Amendment guarantees our right to free pudding. And we can even go one step further. We are owed free pudding because it increases our morale. But it's not always going to be the case with everyone, as I said earlier, now is it? What if free pudding doesn't improve your morale? What if you want a turkey sandwich? How about a bag of Doritos, a free copy of Raid Shadow Legends, a Lamborghini, forgiveness to all debts for all time, or even a hydrogen bomb? Maybe increasing your morale doesn't entail material possessions, but some form of intellectual or emotional enrichment. Whatever it is, the United States Constitution means the federal government of the United States of America is obligated to provide it. Were I politicized, this is the part where I make a call to action for my audience to demand from the federal government our right to whatever we want be recognized. Does well-regulated not mean well-functioning, but instead mean heavily bureaucratized? Well, the federal government would still need a massive bureaucracy to distribute the pudding, so these conditions are still satisfied. Now then, does the text of the U.S. Constitution actually say these things? Yes. Are these my actual views? They might be. Are they ridiculous? I don't believe so. But the important question is, am I wrong? Certainly a lot of constitutionalists will claim I'm stretching the definition of words to make it mean whatever I want it to mean, and therefore I can't be claimed as legitimately being able to, well, claim free pudding from the federal government on the basis of the wording of the Second Amendment, so therefore I am incorrect in my interpretation. However, I would assert that my right to pudding interpretation is correct, but the constitutionalists are also correct, that I am incorrect. You see, let me explain. Think about your favorite fictional universes, Star Trek, Battletech, Steven Universe, Undertale, pick anything. Don't worry, this is going somewhere. You've likely heard fans coming up with theories and interpretations about the universe, solutions to plot holes and mystery boxes. Some have even made careers off of it. They are often wildly varying and even in conflict with one another. You likely have your own headcanons for your favorite franchises. This is known in the literary world as the death of the author, named after the 1968 essay by French literary critic Roland Barthes, I'm not going to try that, titled The Death of the Author. Everyone involved in the work have a different context in which they perceive said work, including the author. How much weight they give to plain text or subtext, the importance of character dialogue, action, or narration, which leads to differing interpretations of fictional work. Even more interesting, the death of the author is itself subject to the death of the author. Literary critics can't agree on what counts for it if it applies only to novels, or if film, TV, or video games count. The importance of the author's own expectations, if the actual events depicted count towards said universe's canon, just ask Star Wars fans about the sequel trilogy if you want an example, or even if canon is a valid concept. But why is it the case that so many interpretations can emerge? Literature, film, TV, any experience, any piece of information has no intrinsic context. People have to create their own context by which to understand this information, and people will always have their own ways of contextualizing information and experiences as well as sense data. Information gathered and how it relates to one another provides the context which foundationally establishes a person's reality, which can be thought of as a narrative one develops about said experiences. These form one's cognitive biases, which weight certain information by its importance, and it is these weights that cause differences in how information is internalized between individuals. Thus, we get to the question of the universalization of internalizing information. A bit of a mouthful. It basically just presupposes the existence of a correct way to interpret things. People reaching different conclusions about the same information entails differences in cognitive biases, and the fact that we're communicating into language shows that learning can happen, so we can establish those as a base of agreement. There's a lot of questions we need to answer first while we circle down this rabbit hole, but one stands out. How do we know there's a correct set of cognitive biases? If so, how do we know that? And how can we be sure our criteria is itself correct? Is that correcting criteria also correct? We can keep going, and so long as we pursue this line of inquiry, we will keep going endlessly. This is called an infinite regress, and suffice to say, we're falling right into it, which makes falsifying the claim that there is a correct way to internalize information impossible. Without falsifiability, the claim cannot be scientific, and if it is not scientific, it is not possible for it to be truthful. We can't get around that by trying for a third option. Is there sometimes a correct way? Is this correct way dynamic or circumstantial? How do you know? Again, infinite regress. Points for thinking outside the box, though. All that's left is the null hypothesis. There is no universal way to internalize information. Again, if this is correct, then without a proving mechanism for internalizing information even being possible, let alone available, all methods are equally valid. This is why death of the author exists. It's an emergent property of consciousnesses interacting with information and formulating their own contexts around how to interpret it. But if you noticed, not once in my explanation did I say that this information problem is limited only to fiction. Pamphlets, economics treatises, academic research, any form of communication, even the script to this very video, are all subject to the interpretation of its consumer, which is no more or less valid than my own. The best I can do is take measures to minimize the discrepancy between my understanding of my own ideas and someone else's understanding of my attempt to communicate them, as can any creator. But the important takeaway is that two people can read the same information on the same user manual and come to conflicting conclusions. This also applies to constitutions and legislation. If this wasn't the case, the state wouldn't need judges to decide what counts as legal or constitutional, now would they? They also wouldn't develop conflicting schools of thought for how to interpret legal theory, they just conformed their behavior to the universal. Actually, how would you know if a state were conforming their behavior to a hypothetical Platonic universal? We'll examine that a bit later. Sure, judges and lawyers spend ungodly numbers of hours researching legal and case precedent, but we're still stuck in the same infinite regress. The correctness of legal claims is independent of history and are dependent entirely on how anyone contextualizes them. All these high-priced lawyers in robes and fancy suits are just describing fan theories, calling it law, and arguing back and forth. It's purely speculative, and in any court, all that's happening is two slash-fic authors trying to schmooze over the judge into agreeing with their headcanon. Literally, every court case should just adjourn with the phrase, "But that's just a theory. A legal theory." At least the game theorists are too much of a gentleman to use you or your resources as collateral in their debates, and they're intellectually honest enough to admit their speculation is just theory. Maybe this is why lawyers have a reputation as crooks and slimeballs. Even if they don't know why, the public intuitively understands that lawyers are full of it, and have understood this for centuries. Even so, when state agents and their misled apologists cite the law as proof of work for how to know justice is achieved, their claim cannot be true. Every interpretation of what is written in a constitution or legislative fiat is equally valid. It's not scientific, so it's impossible to make any truth claims about it. How the law is able to achieve justice, how constitutions protect your rights or grant you your rights, how the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in the 90s in the United States causes the moon to orbit the Earth is completely unknowable. It's a guessing game at best, and those that try to make these appeals have no idea what they're talking about. It's not a claim that's able to be proven, and since those making truth claims carry the burden of proof, without said proof, such claims are false by default. So, no. Constitutions don't defend or create rights. Cops don't enforce the law either. Merely their own interpretation of the law. Well, that's an interesting thought, by the way. If the law is intended to maintain social order as is claimed by state apologists, how can there be as many points of conflict in interpretations for what the law is and what its contents are, how it's enforced, as there are people? How can one even know if the end that is social order is achievable? You can't, clearly. The slimeball's fancy suits, glibness, and ability to articulate 200 years of Virginia state tax court history might seem intimidating, but there's an equivalency between him and the neckbeard who can articulate 8,000 years of Star Wars history without skipping a beat. Even if there was a universal way of interpreting legislative fiat, how could you know for sure that a lawyer or judge were interpreting it in the correct manner? It's the same problem with Plato's philosopher kings. They would claim their decrees conform to the universal when in fact they did not, in order to manipulate the ignorant into doing as they say. What incentive could exist that would cause them to act otherwise? If they are being checked on by their peers for conformity to the universal, they themselves would also see the advantage in merely claiming that their own arguments conform to the universal. This would create either a conspiracy of silence, every philosopher king fully aware that their decrees are self-interested instead of universal, or bring us back to square one, where factions of lying crooks accuse the other of being a lying crook, or both. Both is possible. Even if, in this hypothetical scenario, this universal interpretation were literally beamed into people's heads at birth by God, and continued to be so throughout the remainder of their lives, and they knew full well that this was the universal interpretation, all other interpretations were invalid, and this knowledge and understanding remained with them throughout their lives, well, what would happen? Could this universal interpretation itself be misinterpreted even by incorruptible angels with the best of intentions? If so, we're back to an infinite regress of trying to eliminate misinterpretations of how to interpret. Here's a problem. Well, it's not really a problem, but it depends on your point of view. Information has no inherent context. Those learning any piece of information need to create their own context, which informs how they internalize it. Without a universal context, people choose how information is interpreted. This includes any piece of legislation ever written, including constitutions. Since context is not and cannot be universal, all interpretations are therefore equally valid. We can't get around this by amending legislation or constitutions either. These amendments, even if they're clarifications, need interpretation, which leads us right back to where we started. While the number of reasons legislation cannot produce social order is legion, this is another interesting angle to approach the problem. There is no way of knowing what the legislation says, what it means, and how to know who decides what it means is actually correct. In fact, who does interpret legislation or constitutions? Well, state judges, of course. And given that the judge's employment is dependent on the state, they have an incentive to conform to the interests of political organization. State judges thus can be reasonably assumed to interpret state legislation according to how they perceive the interests of the state. If you can't see the conflict of interest in this, dear viewer, then I can't help you. Certainly, one can point to instances where judges seemingly ruled against the state, but doesn't manipulating people into thinking that the state sometimes sides with non-political actors in their interests as well? Get non-state actors to think the state can serve their interests too? Even so, this whataboutism does not invalidate any observations about the judge's structural incentive through their employer. All it does is list counterexamples that presuppose either they invalidate observations about incentives without explanation, or that the same example cannot be used as an example to prove my point about the state's incentives, such as rulings against the state, actually being used to manipulate politicized state-skeptic people into thinking the state still serves their interests. Spoiler alert, they don't. Repeal does not work either. Ignoring how repealing magical politics papers with legally binding drawings of eagles does nothing to change the nature of their claim the state makes to our resources, or how it uses leverage over our lives and the enforcement of its arbitrarily interpreted policies to oppress us, well, we're still stuck with the same problem. How one interprets legislative or constitutional fiat is still completely subjective, and any claims to causation regarding an increase of liberty, reduction in oppression, or any kind of positive or negative benefit whatsoever is not scientific. Since it's not scientific, it can't be true. It's an opinion at best. So yes, my claim that the United States Constitution's Second Amendment grants me the legal privilege of free pudding is my opinion. It's not based on fact, but the important fact is that I cannot be proven wrong. Neither can the claim that the Constitution grants the privilege of free donuts, free comically oversized bars of gold, free squared circles, or free Dyson spheres. Legislation and constitutions mean nothing. They describe nothing. State apologists that appeal to them have no basis in knowledge, and libertarians that seek to use legal means to achieve their ends do not act on the basis of knowledge. It's like trying to drive down the highway without knowing if you're in a car. You'll never get where you want to go. So, let's make the call to action. Stand up and be heard, and demand that politicized sociopaths guarantee your privilege of free pudding. Do it right now! And if you don't, then that just means you hate pudding. Questions, comments, critique? Do you demand your right to free gold bars? Is there anything else you wish to demand from the government as well? Let me know in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today.